Hello, I'm Corinne Douglas from the Sewing Works in Merrill, Oregon. Today we're going to talk about what we need to get started with free motion or ruler work quilting. First, you need a sewing machine that has the ability to lower the feed dogs. So most sewing machines are equipped with this. It's usually either a lever on the front near the bottom somewhere, or on a Bernina it's on the right side by where the power cord comes in. So you'll want to adjust that for your feed dogs to go down. Secondly, you'll want to get a free motion or ruler foot. So what I prefer for a free motion foot for my Bernina is the number 9 foot, which is a closed toe foot, but the metal around it is thin enough that I can still have maximum visibility, yet it's not so constricting that if my needle wiggles because of fabric movement that I'm not going to ding up my foot or break a needle. Free motion feet are made to hop with the movement of the machine, so most of them are spring loaded, and that also helps to compensate whether you have a thicker quilt and a thicker bat or not. If you're going to be doing ruler work, I highly recommend the number 72 Bernina ruler foot. As you can see, a ruler foot has a much larger shoulder on it. So that helps to keep your ruler butted up against your foot instead of coming up over, which could break a needle, or under. And it also helps keep your spacing in your lines nice and straight. The Bernina foot has a dial adjustment to dial in your ruler foot to the thickness of your quilt, which is very handy. The westerly version of this is either in high or low shank, and it comes with a slide mechanism that you can adjust using your screw on your shank. So when you're determining which foot you need, go see your local westerly dealer or your Bernina dealer to find out which foot is appropriate for your machine. This can also determine what size and thickness of rulers you will be using as well. Next, we need to decide what kind of thread we want to use. So there are many types of thread out there, and depending on whether you want more of a bold look or more subtle look, you might want to consider your options. So my friend Lorena made me a wonderful sample here. I'll show you. And I would recommend doing something similar for yourself to decide what you want to do. So you can see here she's stitched out Isocord, So Fine, Omni, King Tut, and Glide. And they're all gray, but they have a different thread weight and a different kind of sheen or matte to them. So pick the one you like and get started with that. Now, depending on the size of thread that you choose, you might have to get a bigger gauge needle. So I recommend a top stitch 90/40 needle, and that is good for heavyweight threads, and it has a nice large eye for both machine and free motion quilting and rulering. You can use quilting needles, which are better for free motion quilting than rulering. The eye is not any larger than a regular needle, but it will help you keep from skipping stitches because it has a beveled tip. These are specifically designed for quilting. If you're going to use a really fine thread like a 60 weight or a really thin poly, then you could go down to a 75/11 or an 80 needle. But if you're having any kind of thread breakage issues, it's usually because either the eye of your needle is not big enough or your needle gauge itself is not large enough. So needles get bigger as the number increases. Thread gets smaller as the number increases. So a 60 weight thread is smaller than a 40 weight thread. So keep that in mind. So some other accessories you might want to have on your machine include a nice large tray or table, especially for rulering, but anything that can help you keep the weight of your quilting project up on your machine so you're not having to fight it. And then also I highly recommend some kind of quilting gloves to help keep your grip nice and tight on your project. You'd be amazed at how much that makes a difference. Another thing we are finding that's very popular these days is a slider mat. This is a Supreme slider. It's a slick overlay that goes onto your table and allows for more free motion of the material as it glides around. Plus it helps hide any imperfections that might be on the surface of your machine. If you have a little bit of a lip where you might be rulering, it could cause some unevenness, and so this just helps smooth everything out and increases the mobility of your project. So now I'd be happy to show you how to test your tensions. So first, before we can test any tensions, we need to make a quilt sandwich. So the way I like to do this is basically it's a piece of backing fabric, a piece of batting, and then your top of your quilt. My fabric is very plain because I'm going to use it to really accentuate the quilting, so I wanted it to be very plain. I have marked on here the size of the quilt block I'm going to be making, so you can see I have some edge room here, which will help me for knowing where to stop my quilting and not having to worry about running off the edge of my fabric, but also gives me some room to test my tension before I get started on my actual quilt block. If you're participating in the Sewing Works block of the month, Let's Get Started Quilting project, you will want to mark your square 8.5 inches before we continue with the tension test. I am sewing on the Bernina 770, which you can see has a nice large area for quilting and for my project to be elevated on this beautiful Sew Steady table. If you're interested in any of the products that you see here today, feel free to contact us. Let me zoom in and get you dialed in on the needle. Okay. So first what I'm going to do, I need to thread my needle with my handy dandy threader and cut my tail with my cutter. Now to get started, whether you're free motion quilting or ruler quilting, first you will want to probably attach a knee bar for a freehand system, which will help you with your raising and lowering of your foot. So you want to lower your foot, and you see how I have quite a bit of daylight under this foot right now. I'm going to go ahead and use my dial to dial that space down. So I like to run my fabric under my foot and make sure it's moving nice and freely, but that it's not putting a dimple into my fabric. If it's pushing too hard, it can cause some shifting on that top fabric. By the way, I would encourage you to spray baste your quilt sandwich together for stability. You can use pins if you'd prefer, but I find spray based, especially the 505, works well for me. So my presser foot is down. I like my height. If you're using the westerly foot, again, you'll use the slider to get this height right. If you use your ruler foot, you don't want to accidentally have your ruler go over or under that shoulder. So once again, foot's down. I'm going to do needle down and needle back up, holding my tail, and pull that bobbin thread to the top. You can see that little loop coming up. Then I'm going to go ahead and pick up my presser foot and pull my bobbin thread all the way through. Setting it back down in the same spot, I'm going to take several stitches, just moving ever so slightly to get that stitching locked in and holding my tails while I do that. So to check my tension, I'm going to do a couple sharp points in a W type fashion, and then some small circles to check for any eyelashing. So. Now let me just turn this so hopefully you can sort of see what I've done here. I've done some sharp points followed by some circles, and I'm going to now teach you how to tie off, which you will raise your needle, raise your foot, grab the thread from under your foot with either your finger or a scissors or a tweezers. Come back down on where you finish stitching and go needle down and needle up once. Raise your foot, and this is where you want to finesse that bobbin thread up to the top. So you can just see I'm working it out so that this lower loop is my bobbin and the upper loop is my top thread that I just took that last stitch with. It's good to leave yourself about 3 or 4 inches of bobbin thread to tie in. So I'm going to go ahead and cut my bobbin thread there and my top thread, and you'll notice I have 3 tails here. When I pull that away from my machine, the one tail drops down to the bobbin. So let's take a look here. My top points are not quite perfect, but they're pretty close. So I'm going to take the top tension down just a little bit. You'll find you'll probably want to take yours down a little bit. So I was at 5.25. I'm going to drop down to 4.75. See if I like that a little better. You might notice that my stitches were really big here too. I'd want to try to dial that in a little bit better. As long as it's consistent, that's what you're going for, is a nice consistent look. Of course, if you have a Bernina stitch regulator, that's even better. But for rulering, you'll have to regulate yourself. So I'll go ahead and try this tension test again until I get to where it's how I like it. Okay, so a quilter's best friend are these self-threading needles. The Clover self-threading needles. I can see I'm going to need some better lighting in here. So let me get one of these out and show you how they work to tie in all your ends. So depending on what type of design you're doing, whether it's free motion or ruler work, we try not to have to break our threads too often, but it does happen. And sometimes that will not be hidden in a seam. So what you'll do is you'll take one of these needles, which is actually notched open at the top. I know it's really hard to see. Let me see if I can get a little closer for you. So you can kind of see that little V shape in the very top of this needle. So what I'm going to do is I will take my tails that I have just left on my quilt, and I'm going to push them in through that little V on the top of my self-threading needle. And they kind of snap in. So now my needle is threaded. And I will use that needle to tie myself a knot. So I have my needle on my thread still and my square knot. We're zoomed in too much. So my needle is still on my threads, and I have this very loose square knot I've created. So what I want to do is work that square knot down as close as I possibly can to my end of my stitching on my quilt fabric where I stopped sewing. And I'm going to kind of put it at a flat angle so that I'm going into the bat and not coming out on the back side of my fabric. and I'm going to come across and then poke my needle back out. So what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to pull my needle in with my threads, and you'll feel it once that knot hits your fabric here. You'll have to give it a little tug and it just goes right in. Then you can clip your excess thread, which is coming up over here. Might even pull it up a little bit and then clip it, and then when you lay it back flat, your tail has been tied in. And you'll want to repeat that for where you started too, if it's exposed. So I hope that helps, and we look forward to helping you along the way as we get going here. Feel free to reference this video back anytime you need to revisit anything on getting set up, or if you switch threads along the way, you might need to retest your tension, reset your foot if you have a different size bat in a project that you're working on. So keep this video handy, and happy quilting! Thank you from the Sewing Works.